ਅੱਜ ਦੇ ਸੈਗਮੈਂਟ ਵਿੱਚ ਮੇਰਾ ਸਾਥ ਦੇਣਗੇ ਬਰਨੀ ਸਿੰਪਸਨ, ਜਿਹੜੇ ਕਿ ਇੱਕ ਨਾਮਵਰ ਲਾਇਰ ਨੇ, ICBC ਕੇਸਿਸ ਨਾਲ ਡੀਲ ਕਰਦੇ ਨੇ ਤੇ ਹਜ਼ਾਰਾਂ ਹੀ ਲੋਕਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਇਹ ICBC ਨਾਲ ਜੇਕਰ ਕੋਈ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਦਾ ਐਕਸੀਡੈਂਟ ਹੋਇਆ ਹੈ ਜਾਂ ਕੋਈ ਹੋਰ ਸਮੱਸਿਆ ਹੋਈ ਹੈ, ਉਸ ਵਿੱਚ ਇਹਨਾਂ ਨੇ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਬੈਨੀਫਿਟ ਲੈ ਕੇ ਦਿੱਤਾ ਹੈਗਾ। ਹੁਣ ਫੈਡਰਲ ਸਰਕਾਰ, ਤੁਹਾਨੂੰ ਸਭ ਨੂੰ ਪਤਾ ਹੈ ਕਿ ਮੈਰੀਜੁਆਨਾ ਨੂੰ ਜੋ ਹੈ ਲੀਗਲਾਈਜ਼ ਕਰਨ ਜਾ ਰਹੀ ਹੈ, ਤੇ ਉਸ ਦਾ ਕੀ ਇੰਪੈਕਟ ਪਏਗਾ ਡਰਾਈਵਿੰਗ ਦੇ ਉੱਤੇ, ਆਓ ਇਸ ਬਾਰੇ ਵਿਚਾਰ ਕਰਦੇ ਹਾਂ ਤੇ ਜਾਣਕਾਰੀ ਲੈਂਦੇ ਹਾਂ ਬਰਨੀ ਸਿੰਪਸਨ ਤੋਂ। Bernie, welcome to the program.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for being here.
Yeah.
So, federal government is going to legislate marijuana is going to be legalized, and it's going to be a big challenge for everyone. First of all, what do you feel, with your experience being a lawyer for a long time, what legislation will impact the marijuana if it is legalized, and how will it impact the on the roads, and what will happen over there?
Well, the federal government, primarily Justin Trudeau, is determined to enact this legislation to legalize recreational marijuana.
Right.
Medicinal marijuana is already legalized.
Yeah.
And that's supposed to come in June or July. We don't know what format it's going to take, and there's going to be, conditions when you have it and stuff like this. But each province has to enact legislation to accommodate that legislation.
Right.
I've been told by one cabinet minister that 18 pieces of provincial legislation has to be enacted.
Okay.
And they have such a backlog now that I don't think they've passed any more than a half a dozen pieces of legislation in the last 3 months. So I don't know how they're going to do this. It's going to be quite the problem. There's no question that that marijuana does affect your judgment.
Right.
There's two types of marijuana. There's a sativa, and there's another one which helps you go to sleep.
Okay.
I would imagine that most of the people who are going to be driving cars will probably take the sativa, but it does affect your judgment.
Right.
And the problem is going to be there's absolutely no tests that can determine whether you are impaired by marijuana. The police officer can find that you're in possession. They can find that you've taken it.
Right.
But there's no test, as far to my knowledge, that shows that you are actually impaired.
Okay, so that is an interesting factor, that while if you have consumed alcohol, there is a breathalyzer test, but for if you have consumed marijuana, there's no test so far by which the policeman can...
I heard somebody, because Colorado has had this now for 4 years, and I heard somebody who's in charge of the program there, and that question was put by one of the news announcers, and he said there's no actual test. Now, the police have the right to suspend somebody for 24 hours if they feel that their driving is impaired. And impaired could be with drugs.
Yeah.
We've had many cases where people have been on methadone.
Right.
And there's no question their driving was impaired. Once that happens, that's on your record. And that could affect your employment. That could affect your ability to get health insurance. The government, the ICBC, can also use this if you get into an accident, where they say there's a breach of policy, where they won't pay the damage that you've caused, and you may go bankrupt. You may have to pay for it yourself. The ICBC, if I had to describe the attitude of some of the people who run ICBC, if I had to use one word, it'd be authoritarian. And this will be an ideal situation for that authoritarianism to come forward, where they are arbitrarily say there's a breach.
Right.
So the courts are going to be absolutely flooded between the caps, so-called caps that the ICBC or government is going to introduce, and this marijuana legislation. I don't know if the courts are going to have time for anything else. I know that our law firm will be challenging these cases. We don't do the marijuana cases. That'll be some criminal lawyer who do that, but we'll certainly be challenging the other cap cases.
Right.
Yeah.
But again, the question is that as lawyers, law society, have they received some information from the government? Because if it's going to be a legislation, ultimately you ought to know some things.
No, I don't even think the government knows what they're going to, as I say, our inside sources are saying that there's a limited number of drafters in Victoria who draft legislation. They can't keep up with the legislation. I mean, what you have now with legislation, you have the housing crisis, which requires legislation. You have the fentanyl deaths, which require legislation. You have the proportional representation. And on top of all this now, you have well, you have the caps, which requires legislation, and on top of all this, you have the dispute, which could destroy our federal system of government.
Right.
The fights between the provinces now. Saskatchewan has just joined against British Columbia,
Yeah.
and the courts are going to be flooded with this. So I don't think they've even drafted this legislation, but if they drafted it, it's going to be not well thought out.
Right.
I suspect what they're going to say is that you can't have any pot in your car, opened or not opened.
Right.
But I'm not sure what else they're going to be legislating here because there's no tests.
But the question is, on one side, while the BC government is thinking of bringing in a legislation to cap the motorists by $5,500, as we discussed in one of the programs, but now in future, because impaired driving is probably going to increase with the consumption of marijuana, recreational marijuana. So what do you think on the roads? Of course, there will be more accidents.
More accidents.
So what will happen? How all this will be handled? The courts are already busy with other things, so it's going to be a big mess.
And of course, the victims are going to be at fault for all of this, you know, then the public's going to be at fault, not the government that's enacted, the federal government that's pushing through this ill-conceived legislation, or the provincial government which is going along with it. You know, there is the potential for more accidents being on the road. There's no question about that.
Right.
So there probably be zero tolerance for any marijuana in the car. But again, how are they going to test whether you are impaired?
Well, that's what the question is.
My understanding of marijuana is there's three main component parts to marijuana, and one of those component parts can stay in your system for 6 weeks.
Okay.
You know, so it's going to be very interesting.
Your law firm has been practicing for a long period. How are you now coming up with this? How are you going to cope up with all this?
Well, we are. We've actually put ourselves into kind of a. How would I describe it? When caps were first announced a few months ago, we took certain steps, which are designed to fight those caps. And if the caps come in, we made a decision to take on these cases.
Right.
We're very well positioned to do that. We have the deep pockets, as is evident by our involvement in the Jago wedding case, if you recall. I believe it was on August 17th, 2007, you know, in Abbotsford, where there was 30 people who were terribly injured, 6 were killed, and we represented 27. So we have the deep pockets to take on these cases, and we will fight for the rights of victims of car accidents.
Thank you very much for being here. It's always a pleasure to learn
Thank you.
from you, and especially when you give in-depth information to our viewers, which they can.
I wish I
benefit
could
from.
give
Thank you.
in-depth information about what's waiting for us with the caps and what's
Well,
waiting
we'll
for us
talk
for the
after
pot.
this- After this legislation is introduced, what happens on the roads, and we'll again talk to our viewers again. Thank you very much for being
Okay, thank you.